All right, Pouring Nation, I'm going to let you know what consistency of paint I use for a bunch of different techniques. Now, the consistencies I'm talking about is going to be thin, where you don't see a mound when you drip it in, medium, regular, where you see a mound when you drip it in, and thick, where it's a mound upon a mound when you drip it in. Now, there's lots of variation between the two, and every person's going to do it a little different, but this gives you a general idea for each of these techniques, which consistency of paint I use. And I have this grid of information in a blog post, which I'll link below. While I'm going through this, if you have questions or you disagree with the types of paint that I do, let me know in the comments below. Let's all learn together about the best consistencies to use for all of these acrylic paint pouring techniques. So the first technique is the traditional pour. We're just pouring individual paints on the canvas, then tilting. Any thin, regular, thick, they all work great for the traditional pour. Next is the Treering Pour. We're putting all the paints together in a cup and then pouring them out in a ring formation to make tree rings. And again, thin, regular, and thick work great for this technique. The next is a straight pour. All of our paint's in the thing and we're just pouring straight out. We're not doing circles, we're not going side to side, just straight out. Sometimes we're adjusting how quickly or how slowly we come out. And in this regard, I think thin and regular work great. Thick, a little bit thicker works, but once you get so thick, you're gonna lose any of the effects you might get by doing a straight pour. I don't think it works as well with thick. So that's a halfway for me. The next is a dirty pour, which ultimately is just how you put the paint in the cup. But because it's a dirty pour, I don't think you get really the effects that you want if the paint is too thin or it's too thick. Regular is the best, and you can go a little bit out of those bounds with thin and thick, but too thin, too thick, I don't think it works very well. Next is the Puddle Pour. The Puddle Pour works great with thick paints. It works great with medium paints. With thin paints, it just starts mixing together and making mud. So thin paints, I do a medium. I don't think that one works as well. Strainer or colander pour, all three. Thick, thin, regular, all three work great for this technique. The bottle bottom pour, same thing. All three work great for the bottle pour technique. Web or injection pour. This is the pour where you pour your paint out and then you take a squeeze bottle or something, you kind of push it underneath the paint and it creates webbing there. This doesn't work for thick paint. It works for medium paint and it works for thin paint, and you have to make sure you get the right densities of paint so you get the paint coming up and some of the paint going down, but thick just doesn't work. So thin and regular for the web or injection pour. Next is the dip or smash pour. Too thin, it just goes everywhere. Makes mud. Too thick and it doesn't do anything. So regular is the best and it can go out of those bounds a little bit on the thin side, a little bit on the thick side, but generally for a dip or a smash pour, I like being kind of right in the center and it not going everywhere. And I know there are some people that disagree with that, but that's my personal preference for the dip and smash pour. The hammer pour, that's where you put the paint down and you hit it with a hammer or something to kind of make it plop around. Sometimes they use a trowel or something to kind of push the paint out. Because you want the paint to move, you can't really do thick paint there. Medium paint and medium thin paint work great. Again, the more you agitate it, the more it's going to make mud, so too thin and it just makes a bunch of mud. Next is the balloon dip. You have the same problem. Medium paint works great, too thick, and it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't give you cool effects. Too thin, it just turns into mud. So right in the middle, regular, and a little bit on the thin side, a little bit on the thick side. The split cup pour, any type of paint will work fine. You put that paint in the split cup, pour it out, and you'll get great results. You'll get more cells and more mixture if it's thin, less cells and more defined color when it's thick. All of them work. String pull, it really doesn't work well for very thick paint. Regular paint and just slightly into the thin side. Otherwise, it just kind of goes everywhere and you kind of lose the whole effects that you're trying to get with the string pull. Pour. Dutch pour, thin. and a little bit into the regular, but once you get too far there, it just doesn't do anything. It doesn't do what you're expecting it to do. So thin's the best. A little bit on the thin side of regular. Thick really just doesn't work for the Dutch pour. Swipe or ghost pour, best right in the middle. Again, you can go a little bit thicker, you can go a little bit thinner, but if you go too heavy on both sides, you're not going to get any cells or lacing on one side, and you're just going to get a muddy mess on the other side. The Blob Pour, super thick. You really need to use super thick paint so you can get it to stack up and really create those nice blobs. Cloud Pour, the whole idea is to get that paint moving. The pearl cells on the outside, I'm going to consider that kind of similar thing. So you want the thin or the medium paint so that paint can move up and down based on density. The thicker it is, the less you're going to get any of that, those cells coming up, the cloud cells or the pearl cells. SheleeArt Blooms, interestingly enough, you want to be regular and some on the thick side to make that really work. Too thick and you don't really get the lacing that you're looking for. Too thin, again, you're manipulating it too much, so you get a lot of mud. So it's going to be regular or on the thick side. Waterfall Angel Wing Pour, regular, a little bit on the thick side, almost exactly like the SheleeArt Blooms. If it's too thin, it just runs and goes everywhere. You don't keep your shape. If it's too thick, it doesn't move, and it's hard to keep the shape anyways. You have to use You have to lose a lot of paint to make it give you that angel wing or waterfall technique or waterfall look. The wave or intentional pour, right in the middle, maybe a little bit on the thin side, so you get a little bit of mixture and you get a little cell action. With the thick paint, you're almost just doing regular painting rather than pour painting. With the thin, if it's too thin, it just goes everywhere and makes mud. Dentrites, you have to have thin paint, but you don't want to move it around because the thin paint, you want the water in the thin paint to kind of move out, and that's what makes your chaos or your dendrites on the outside of that. So very thin paint for the dendrites. Are there techniques that I missed or things that you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, if you're having trouble getting the right consistency for any of these techniques, this is the video that you need to watch next.